Okay, we don't have anyone else in the waiting room at the moment, so we'll just go ahead and start the evening. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm joining you from the Western Isles, and it's a beautiful evening here. So I hope it's a beautiful evening with everyone else, and yeah, I hope you're happy enough to be indoors on such a lovely day. I promise it'll be an interesting evening. So I'll just start with a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. And there is a privacy notice up on the screen at present explaining that, and a link to the privacy notice on our website, so please be aware of that. So it is being recorded, so you're welcome to leave your cameras on if you wish, or if you would prefer, please feel free to turn them off. All participants are very welcome to ask questions. I'll explain the format of the evening in a minute, but just be aware that if you do want to ask a question, there's multiple ways you can do it. So you can use the raise hand function, which on my screen is at the bottom of the screen, but I know it's different on different devices. But raise a hand and we'll come to you, and you can, in an old-fashioned way, actually speak. Or if you're not comfortable doing that, you can use the chat box, which is absolutely allowed as well. So whatever you're more comfortable with, please go ahead. We absolutely would love to hear your feedback about tonight. Now, we do these on a roughly monthly basis. We found that we used to go kind of around the country to kind of town halls and community centres, and they were absolutely fantastic. But we found actually that virtual meetings have allowed us to get to meet and speak to many more people across the country. But we always know we can improve them. So we'd love to hear your feedback. So a survey will come up at the end on your screen. There's a link on up now, but a survey will come up at the end as well. So I'm just going to go around the panel just now and introduce everyone. Then I will be handing over to one of my colleagues to do a very short presentation. And then we're going to have a very open question and answer session. We won't have all the answers. We can't, but we're here to listen. We're here to find out what matters to you, and that helps shape our work going forward. And I have a reputation for being a stickler for time, which I don't think is really fair, but I promise I will be a stickler to time tonight and let you all home by 8:30 at the latest. I usually say if we finish early, we'll finish early, but we never do. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of conversation to keep us going till 8:30. Okay, so this evening, our panel tonight, we have Megan McInnes, who is one of our commissioners, and I'll pass over to her just to introduce herself.
Hi, good evening, everyone. So yes, I'm one of the land commissioners, and I'm joining you all from Applecross up in the northwest Highlands of Scotland. Thanks.
Thank you. And Andrew Thin.
Hi everyone, I'm based on the Black Isle, just across the water from Moray. I'm currently chairman of the Land Commission. I'm also chairman of Scottish Canals, and I do also work actually in a couple of Scotland's prisons as an independent inspector.
Thanks, Andrew. And then we're joined by James, one of our staff members. He's one of our policy and practice leads.
Good evening, I am James McKessick-Leach, formerly of Avis. I recognise some names in the chat, so it's good to see people that are familiar, and good to meet some more. I'm policy and practice lead with the Land Commission, currently based in Inverness.
Thanks. And the Scottish Land Commission with no name is Jess, who is our communications manager, and she is the one of us tonight who is working the absolute hardest. She's keeping the show running in the background. She's going to be filling the chat with the links. She's going to be keeping me right. She's going to be watching out for all the raised questions. And she and her team have done the hard work in the background to get all of this working, get this all set up. So thank you so much to Jess and her team for all of that. And she's there in the background keeping us all right. So can't thank her enough. And finally, my name is Sally Reynolds. I'm joining you tonight from the Isle of Lewis. I'm one of the land commissioners, and in my day job, I'm a development manager with a community landowner in the Carloway area of the Isle of Lewis, which many of you will know from the Cullish stones, which are a fairly famous tourist attraction here. So that's the kind of area that we cover. So it's lovely to be here and to be joined by so many people. And I'm going to hand over to Megan now, who's going to do a very brief presentation, and then we'll get into our question and answer. So over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Sally. And if I can get the presentation to work, then I will start. Yes, so I'm just going to spend about 15 minutes just giving a brief overview to giving an introduction on who the Land Commission is and what it is we are up to. So we have been tasked with driving forward land reform, but well, what is land reform? Why does it matter? Well, I like starting to talk about this using real life examples. We're all really aware of the big iconic community buyouts, the Isle of Egg, Carloway Estate in Lewis, and more recently Langham Moor from the Buccleuch Estate down in the Borders. And these are examples of land reform, but land reform is also so much more than this, and it's also so much closer and part of what we are already seeing in our everyday lives. And I wanted to just give a couple of examples from the Moray area. I hope you recognise these two photos. The top one is, of course, is the Tumultowel and Glenlivet Development Trust, which was set up in 2012 in response to concern within the community about tackling the economic decline in the area. And since then, they've been incredibly active, delivering a whole range of different community benefit projects. They manage now the museum and visitor centre here, as well as the local hostel. The photo in the bottom of the slide is what's known as the old Tesco site on Caroline Street, right in the centre of Forest. This site has looked like this for nearly 20 years now, since Tesco moved its supermarket out to the outskirts of town. It could have been converted into affordable housing or hotels or green space or allotments or loads of other community benefit projects, instead of which it is sadly sitting there now just attracting rubbish and antisocial behaviour. These two examples, and I could have chosen any number from across Scotland, illustrate how beneficial land reform can be, how transformative it can be for a local community, but also how urgent it continues to be across Scotland. Because land reform can help to ensure that a vacant and derelict site stops being a blight on a local community and becomes an asset. It can help ensure that families have somewhere to live that they can afford in a place, a good quality home, and that they can afford in the place they want to live, rather than having to move away. It can help ensure that communities are able to be involved in decision-making around land which are going to impact on them, rather than being excluded from that. And of course, it also helps to support successful and resilient crofting and farming communities. So at the Land Commission, we see land reform as part of a key part of the package of things which are required to help create resilient and successful communities right across Scotland. And it's also a central part of the broader response to the big public policy challenges that we as a country face, responding to the pandemic and the economic recovery and renewal that's required after that, responding to the climate emergency, the need to build resilient communities and to promote and protect human rights. And this is why we, all of us at the Commission, believe so passionately in the importance of land reform and what we are doing. So who are we? Well, the Land Commission is one of the outcomes of the 2016 Land Reform Act, and we were created by the Parliament in 2017. We are 5 Scottish land commissioners. We are one tenant farming commissioner, and we are supported by an amazing but small team of individuals like James and Jess, who prior to the pandemic were based out of our office in Inverness. So our role is to provide advice and recommendations and leadership around the changes of law and policy, as well as the changes in culture and practice that are needed on the ground to push forward a wide-ranging programme of land reform, which is relevant to urban and rural areas. And our advice is aimed to make all of us be able to make more of Scotland's land for the benefit of everyone. Before I get into the detail of our work, I want to talk for a moment about a key Scottish Government policy which is underpinning everything we do on our programme of land reform, and that is the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. This is another outcome of that 2016 Land Reform Act. It's actually the first of its kind in the world in terms of articulating the relationship between land reform and human rights. And it recognises that along with rights to land as a landowner or a land manager come responsibilities, and not just responsibilities to local communities and your neighbours, but also responsibilities to make sure that that land is delivering for the wider public good. Prior to the statement, we often saw the protection of private property in Scotland as a hindrance to progressing land reform, but through this statement, Scotland has moved in line with the rest of the world in recognising that land reform can be a means of progressing human rights, and human rights can themselves be a means of helping to achieve land reform. And it's finding a better balance between the protection of private property rights and the protection and support of the wider human rights relating to land, what are called the economic, social and cultural rights. It's finding the right balance, which is really at the heart of a lot of what we are doing. And this is also going to be something which has a lot of attention in the next few years in Scotland, because the Scottish Parliament have committed both to a new human rights bill as well as a new land reform bill. And we have a blog on our website by Professor Alan Miller, who's a human rights expert, which articulates some of this in more detail, if you're interested. I should say, as I go through this presentation, Jess is working very hard, putting in links to the various different things I talk about in the presentation. So keep an eye on the chat box and those links as they come up. So in terms of what we're actually doing, we're about halfway through our second 3-year strategic plan, which runs from 2020 to 2023. And this has 3 different work streams: reforming land rights, responsible land ownership and use, and reforming land markets. And I'm going to speak about each of these in turn. So it's key that the way in which we own, manage and use land has an impact on the distribution of wealth, resources and benefits across Scotland. And this means that achieving wider government targets, such as tackling inequality or responding to the climate emergency, require us to rethink and reform this framework of land rights within which we operate. So we're doing a range of different pieces of work on this. We're encouraging a more diverse pattern of land ownership, and we'll be publishing some research which is looking at the social and economic impacts, the positive social and economic impacts as a result of having a more diverse pattern of land ownership. We'll be publishing this research in May. This is a piece of work that James has been leading on, so I'm sure he'll be able to answer your questions in detail about this when we get to the Q&A session. Another piece of work that James has also been leading on is work to identify new governance models to widen the range of people who benefit from land. We tend in Scotland to have single actors owning a piece of land, a public actor, a private actor, a community or an NGO landowner, whereas across Europe it's much more common to have much more innovative hybrid models, or which combine these different actors taking joint responsibility and ownership for a piece of land. So again, we've been looking at what those kind of models what we can learn from these models and what we might want to draw on here in Scotland. Another piece of work is this ongoing work to find the right balance between the protection of private property rights and the wider human rights relating to land, the economic, social and cultural rights. Another piece of work which has been core to this work stream has been the research we've been doing to better understand the impact of Scotland's uniquely highly concentrated pattern of land ownership. We were asked by the Scottish Government back in 2018 to research the impact of this pattern, and we published the results of this in early 2019, along with a series of recommendations for what might be done to tackle this problem. We focused in both in the research, the evidence and then the subsequent recommendations focused in on the problems associated with monopoly land ownership and monopoly control over the decision-making relating to land. One of the suggestions we made is that there needs to be a test for the public interest in large-scale land transfers, and the Scottish Government has committed both to look at this problem of the highly concentrated pattern of land ownership and the role that a public interest test might play in the new land reform bill. So we expect this area and these proposals to be something which continues to get quite a lot of attention. The second work stream is around responsible land ownership and use, and this looks at whoever owns a piece of land, looking at what can be done to make sure that they're doing it in a way which is more responsible both to local communities and also to the wider public. So the core of this work stream is what we call the Good Practice Programme, and that is a team of staff who are working very hard to help landowners and local communities implement the land rights responsibilities statement on the ground. That's this core government policy that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that underpins everything we're trying to do. So we've published a series of protocols which provide detailed guidance on how the statement and its principles can be implemented, as well as further tools and guidance. And we've worked with over 150 landowners and local communities in the last year to bring that to life on the ground in their own work. We've also late in this year now going to be expanding that work to help to operationalize, to mainstream the land rights responsibility statement within the operations of public bodies, local authorities, and also the private sector. Most recently also we have been working with the Scottish Government as they have been consulting and undertaking a review of the impact of the land rights and responsibility statement within its first 5 years of operation. The third of our work streams is around reforming land markets. Now, since we began our activities back in 2017, one of the key things that we've been trying to understand is why it is that Scotland's land markets are not operating as effectively or efficiently as they could be. And what I mean by this, for example, is why it is that in some parts of Scotland, we have a desperate need for land for affordable housing and development projects, whereas in other parts of Scotland, we have large areas of vacant and derelict land, which have been sitting empty for decades. So tackling this problem of vacant and derelict land is one of the first things we put our minds to. The old Tesco site in Forest, which I started this presentation with, is by no means unique. There are more than 3,000 vacant and derelict sites across Scotland, totaling around 11,000 hectares. And it's a really entrenched problem. In Moray alone, there's 19 different vacant and derelict sites on the Scottish Government register, totaling around 16 hectares of land. And these sites are not just causing a blight on the local community, but they're also a real missed opportunity in terms of what you could do productively with that land, whether it's for green space or housing or many other kinds of uses which would have a benefit locally and economically. So together with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, we launched the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which really brought national attention to the issues and published a whole load of different recommendations, which are now being taken forward by the government and different stakeholders at different levels. And in fact, this month in March, we are hosting a land reuse month, which is focusing on supporting local authorities think about what they can do to tackle vacant and derelict sites within their areas, as well as helping them develop tools to prevent buildings and sites in the future becoming derelict. So we have a series of events going on throughout this month. So please sign up for those if you're interested. Jess is going to put the link in for these events into the chat box. Another piece of work which we have recently published is a 2-year assessment on the way in which land is being brought forward for housing and for development. And this really looked at the fact that reforms are needed on how land is brought forward for development in order to create places that people want to live in at prices they can afford. And the overarching conclusion of this research, and again, Jess will be putting the link in for this work as I speak, hopefully. The overarching conclusion of this is that a market-led model is simply not delivering affordable homes in the right places, and that we need to see instead the public sector and public bodies providing a much greater leadership role in terms of the delivery of houses across Scotland, both in urban and rural areas. Another piece of research which we have recently published is around the relationship between land reform and taxation. So land and property taxes have the potential to help us achieve a whole range of different long-term outcomes relating to land reform, such as land diversification of land ownership, town centre regeneration, a just transition to net zero, and also supporting an active farming community. And so the Scottish Government asked us to look in detail at the relationship between land reform and tax and fiscal studies, and this work was supported by an expert advisory group, and we published the results of this earlier on this year. And this sort of really focuses on two areas of recommendations. The first are around the future options for taxing land values, and the second are around future reform options for much broader outcomes around supporting economic recovery and achieving the wider land reform objectives that we're all trying to work towards. A topic which we've been giving a lot of attention to recently has been the relationship between the changes required to meet the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis, and what this means for land ownership and land values. Because we all reckon, well, it is quite clear that responding to these crises will require significant changes to land use, whether it's increasing woodland, peatland restoration, better soil and carbon management, green infrastructure, etc., etc. And there are huge opportunities here for Scotland. We can see that in the way that the markets responded in this area very rapidly over the last 12 months. But there are also really significant risks, and it's the risks for what this means that the Land Commission is really focusing on, because it's essential that making these changes to land ownership and use are done in a way that ensures that communities and local economies are able to share the benefits and are not being asked to pay an unfair burden of the costs. In short, that this is a just transition to our net zero targets. So we have a whole range of different pieces of work on this area, and actually just yesterday we published a land-focused paper on natural capital and land, which outlines the broader context and some of these recommendations in more detail, accompanied by a great blog by Andrew. And basically our work there is looking at what the implications are for the actual housing, the actual land market, what's actually going on in terms of land transactions. We're looking at what can be learnt historically and from other countries around the best models for enabling communities to share a benefit in this. And we're also looking at how the companies and the investors involved in the carbon and natural capital markets can behave responsibly, such as implementing the land rights and responsibilities statement within their own operations. Now, I can't finish a presentation without mentioning the work of our Tenant Farming Commissioner, Dr. Bob Mcintosh. So he has a role in statute to improve relations between tenant farmers and landowners. He and the team have been publishing a series of codes of practice and other guidance to help to improve elements of that relationship, and they very frequently respond to inquiries and alleged breaches of those codes. They have been doing a lot of work recently on the role of mediation as a more successful route to helping to improve relations rather than relying on legal routes. And they've also been doing work recently on supporting new entrants, for example, co-launching the land matching service with the Scottish Government, and some work with a number of different tenant farmers on succession planning. So I wanted to end this presentation just to tell you about a new hub called My Land Scotland, which we set up recently, which is a hub of different case studies and stories and information and podcasts, which can help you learn more about how individuals and organisations across the country are changing the land around them and subsequently transforming their communities. We wanted to do this to get away from the idea that land reform is really technical and really geeky, and just demonstrate how exciting and how real and how much it's actually happening on the ground near you. So please come and join the conversation, tell your own stories and find some inspiration. For me, one of the most exciting parts of myland.scot programme and campaign is the Lay of the Land podcast, in which Callum McLean holds a series of conversations with different activists and people involved in land and land reform. For example, he's had a conversation with Darren McGarvey recently, and the most recent one is a conversation with Naveed Baksh from Boots and Beards, which is a Glasgow-based walking group who are interested in promoting diversity and getting people outdoors for walks for health, well-being and health. So I'm going to finish now and hand back to Sally. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I just lost my mute button there as the screen was changing. Thanks very much, Megan. That was great. And I think it shows the absolute wide breadth of our work and the topics. So we're now going to go into our question and answer session. And I'm really pleased we've already had a question in the chat box. This very much references to what Megan was talking about in the presentation. And I'm going to pass this to James, just to give his thoughts on it. And I think what we'll do is take this opportunity to talk about this topic in the widest sense, so in the whole, because it's a really critical topic, and I know lots of you will want to hear about it tonight. So, James, how or what have you harnessed for public and community benefit in relation to net zero, which is not a financial burden directly or indirectly? So this links back obviously to the just transition that Megan was talking about. And thanks, Martin, for the question.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the first thing to say is we haven't quite got that far yet. We're still very much investigating the various different routes and the mechanisms by which kind of the investment is being made, both in terms of land acquisitions, but also the sort of returns, the financial modelling that's going with these sorts of developments, particularly at the moment with the two options that are up and running. So around woodland and forestry carbon, and then the slightly more recent one around peatland carbon for peatland restoration. So it's still very early days in our works. We haven't really kind of found any solutions yet, but we are, I think as Megan mentioned in her presentation, we are working with individual landowners who have already begun that journey to understand how the finances work, where the returns are made, and how some of the benefits could be shared, and also what type of benefits there are. So there's always the temptation, I think, to assume that benefits equals cash in hand for community, but there are wider benefits as well, and there can be things like shared governance and decision making. There can be things like provision of infrastructure or community facilities that potentially go hand in hand with these types of developments. So there's a much wider picture to look at. The other strand of our work around benefits is looking at some of the historical approaches that have been taken to other types of essentially natural resource windfalls. So perhaps more recently looking at renewable energy, seeing how particularly onshore wind and the various models that have been used there to share benefits, whether that's again the kind of community benefit model, or whether we're looking at things more like shared community ownership or cooperatives that deliver a different type of benefits at different levels for different communities and different people. But even going further back than that, looking at things like the oil and gas industry as well, perhaps not so much at a national level, but people may be familiar with the route that Shetland and to a lesser extent Orkney took in terms of building up a local oil fund that has generated investment over the long term and is still very much part of those communities. So there's a whole range of different models, even within the Scottish context, that we're looking at. And then the next phase of our work will also look at some of the options and mechanisms that are being considered abroad. So I'm afraid I don't have a direct answer for that yet, but we're very much working on it. And actually, to be fair, any kind of ideas or experience from these sectors would be welcome.
Thanks very much, James. That's really interesting. And I was actually in a meeting here last night about offshore wind, and we've got an upcoming potential development here. So we were actually having really early stage conversations about what do benefits to the community look like, and how do we ensure that they are fair. And it was really interesting because it's not just about money; it's about all the other things: education, employment, infrastructure. And it's really interesting just to think about the parallels as well and what can be learned. Andrew's got his hands up, and I know this is a topic close to his heart, and I know he's got a lot of experience actually from some of the kind of renewables experience. So over to you, Andrew, to give some thoughts on this.
Sally, thanks. Yeah, I was kind of involved in the wind farm community benefit. Martin, it actually would be quite helpful if you could elaborate your question about. Actually, if you want to stick your hand up, I dare say Sally would bring you in, but because I'd quite like to understand what what's behind your question. Oh, there's Martin. Sally, would you mind if we let Martin in? Because I think it might help me.
No, not at all. And it's actually just reminded me, I was actually going to ask if I was actually looking to see whether Martin had his camera on. I was actually going to say to everyone, you don't have to use the raise hand function. If you wave, I'll also let you in that way. So it'll be even more old fashioned. You can just wave and speak is absolutely fine. So Martin, it'd be great to hear whether we've understood your question right or not, I guess. Oh, we're not hearing you. No. Is anyone else hearing? Is it just me?
No, I can't hear you, Martin.
No, sorry, Martin, we can't hear you.
But the mute button is showing on your.
Oh, you're muted now, but you are unmuted. Yeah, you're muted. It's saying that you're muted. Oh, that's you unmuted. Try now. No. Sorry. We'll leave you a few minutes and see if you can figure out if it's your microphone or not, or if you can type in the chat box to tell us a wee bit more. That would be great.
Sally, maybe I should continue. Would that be helpful?
You can carry on talking. If you do work it out, Martin, just interrupt and come in. That'd be great.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Yeah, so it is a huge subject. Thanks, Sally, and Martin, thank you too. And we've just put the link up, I think, to Bob's very recent piece of advice, which is specifically about tenant farming, but there's some quite useful background stuff in that piece that's useful for everyone to see. So you don't have to be a tenant farmer to get something useful from that. And we also, well, we published a blog yesterday, but we will be publishing some more research. I guess there's a few points to make. Scotland's got a huge potential, rural Scotland, and oddly enough, especially the uplands and in places like Moray and Highland and so on. We've got huge potential to sequester carbon and sequester a lot more carbon than we currently do by different forms of land use. And the capacity to sequester carbon will have an enormous financial value, because as we push harder and harder to net zero, companies will be forced by legislation to offset emissions. So they will have to buy the capacity to sequester carbon. And you're already seeing that. Forward-looking companies who think ahead are buying huge scalps of land now with a view to sequestering carbon and offsetting their emissions further down the line. So then the question is, so if that's all happening, that's wonderful for the person who owns the land, and no doubt wonderful for the company. But what about the people what about local folk? And this is absolutely no different in a way from the wind farm situation, where we had landowners suddenly finding that the top of a hill, which had been worth nothing, was worth a fortune, and people diving in and buying the tops of hills to stick turbines on. And in that instance, we were actually very successful, and I was part of it, in getting to a place where pretty much all the developers agreed to pay what amounted to a royalty in the form of community benefit. And you can argue whether it was enough, whether it was big enough, but it's there, and a lot of communities have actually managed to do a lot of things on the back of that. So we will need to try and do exactly the same on the back of sequestering carbon. To do that, government, I think, and society needs levers. And I think the work that we need to do over the next while is helping government to make sure it has the right levers. So, for example, if it's to be a forestry to sequester carbon, government has levers, because government permits the planting of trees, and indeed often financially assists, or usually financially assists them. So government has levers. But if it's, for example, sequestering carbon by blocking up drains in a peat bog, government may not at the moment have the right levers, but it is likely, because carbon offsetting will be tradable, it is likely that government will have levers. So I'm very optimistic about this. But as Sally said at the beginning, this is very, very early days. And I mean, the short answer to Martin's question is we're not there yet. The long answer is, what you're pushing at, Martin, is of huge importance to rural Scotland over the next decade. So that's maybe enough from me by way of overview, but Martin's trying again, so let's see if it works.
And I don't think we can hear you, Martin, I'm afraid. Try speaking. Oh, sorry, we can't. Sorry, can't hear you. I'm going to go to Marion, and then we'll come back to you, Martin, and try again. Apologies. Over to you, Marion, with your question. I hope we have more luck with the technology here.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. That's great.
Is that okay? Yes, right. A couple of things, well, more than a couple, I suppose. How can land ownership be regulated? And I'm referring to asset management companies, very rich people buying up huge tracts of land in Moray at the minute with the sole intention of planting trees. And tenant farmers are not having their leases renewed. for instance, near where I live, there's a proposal for 1.2 million trees to be built. We already have some trees. I don't have an issue with trees, but I do have an issue with a 750,000 Sitka spruce, which is an invasive native, not a native species, and 500,000 of other trees in a very small area. As I say, at the expense of the 2 tenant farmers who have been here for an awful long time. The other issue I have is that these forestry planting schemes are advertised as tax avoidance, and public money. I know that the Scottish National Investment Bank has invested 50 million in a particular company, forestry scheme, and they're advertising, planting in trees enables you tax advantages, tax avoidance. I have a real issue about investing public money into schemes like this, whether it's for trees or whether it's for anything else. And I do have a concern about carbon, the net zero. We're not actually reducing our carbon. All we're doing is planting trees to sell off the carbon credits to offset what we're producing anyway. We're not actually reducing our carbon footprint at all. So my question is really, how are you going to control large companies, asset management companies, very rich people coming in, buying huge tracts of land, which local people can't afford to buy because the price goes up? And is there a mechanism whereby you can actually do anything about these schemes being for tax avoidance? Those are my 2 questions, really.
Thanks, Marion. And I think what you have, thank you very much. And I think what you've done is actually managed to include Martin's comment in your question, which is fantastic. So I think you've managed to include some of what Martin was talking about in your question, which is great. I'm actually going to pass this to, I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to let every panel member comment on this. There's some really fundamentals in there, which we're not going to be able to solve for you. I'm going to be totally honest. But I think there's some real fundamentals that open up a really important conversation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to let each panel member give their thoughts on it. And I'm going to pass to Megan first, because we haven't heard from her yet on this.
Thanks, Sally. Yes, I think I would agree with Andrew and Martin and Marion in terms of the fact that this is something we get asked about a huge amount at the moment, and it's obviously an incredibly important and critical issue across different parts of Scotland. The government is also very cited on the fact that it's a really important issue, and that's why they've asked us to really focus our efforts on this. We don't have all the answers yet. These are not easy things to deal with. As Andrew said, there's potential to regulate some of this through the existing frameworks. For example, the frameworks governing the woodland code and the carbon code, or the frameworks governing the way in which trees are planted. There's also clearly, though, the need for exploration of additional policy and regulatory tools to address this. We're still working on this, and lots of other different organisations, Nature Scott and others, are also putting and all of our best heads together to try and figure out what the various different solutions are, what can be done through investment regulations and company regulations, what can be done through regulations around forestry and carbon peatland restoration activities, what can be done through planning, what can be done through other things. But we are definitely not there yet. Unfortunately, this pattern repeats what's happened previously with previous natural resource booms, where the market responds very quickly and private actors respond very quickly, and it takes a while for the regulators and the policy frameworks to catch up. So frustrating as that is, it is just part of how these things happen, and we do have to make sure that the reason why we've decided, as always, to take an evidence-based response to this is that we can make sure that the recommendations we're making about the regulations which should be introduced, for example, are based on evidence of what's actually happening on the ground, so that we don't end up creating a situation which would even be more complicated by suggesting the wrong regulations. One of the things that we have gone back to from the very start of all of the discussions around the natural capital boom around land and the impact that was having on land markets is the fact that the land rights responsibilities statement should provide a framework for outlining the responsibilities of landowners, and that's new landowners that come in and buy estates immediately, as well as existing landowners. And that should be the starting point for discussions, for example, engaging with local communities around decisions which are going around change, such as planting 1.2 million trees in an area which are going to have an impact on the local community. So there is quite a lot that can be done already with the existing frameworks, but it is definitely not enough, which is why we are really focusing quite a lot of our resources on this question, and hopefully we'll have some more. Well, if the answers we have will have moved down the road by the next time we get a chance to speak to you. That's probably all I want to say right now on this, Sally. Thanks.
Thanks, Megan. That was really good. And I was thinking as you were speaking, one of the interesting things about this topic is that it brings in just what you talked about there, Marion, it brings in so many different pieces of our work. So it brings in our work on taxation, brings in our new work on natural capital, it brings in our good practice work on the land rights responsibilities, but it also brings in the work that we did earlier on concentrated land ownership. And it brings in all of those different topics, and it actually shows how hard land reform is, that you've got to try and get all those things lined up right to get the right action moving forward. But hopefully, because we've done those chunky bits of work in the background and in the past, it'll help us with the evidence we now, as Megan speaks about, to kind of move forward in a kind of thoughtful and sensible way. I'm going to ask if James or Andrew would like to come in now on this. Oh, Andrew would.
Yeah, Marion, thanks. I mean, first of all, let's just be blunt. Why is it saying this? I'm hoping you can hear me. Let's just be blunt. We simply don't have the tools in Scotland at the moment to regulate land ownership in the way that many other countries do. And I think, you know, so you know, in a sense, what you say is bang on the button. We don't have it. I remember speaking some time ago now to a major foreign landowner in Scotland, and I said to him, "Why on earth do you come here to own land? What's wrong with staying at home?" And he said, "Well, it's quite straightforward. I can do things here I can't do at home." And that was, you know, he was from another part of Europe. He wasn't from the other side of the planet. So we've got some way to go, and let's be blunt about that. But that's why we've got the Land Commission, because we've been set up to advise government as to how on earth we can regulate land better in Scotland. So let's start with one of the points you made, which is these huge chunks of land changing hands willy-nilly with a checkbook, or sometimes off market. You don't even know it's happening. And so we've done a big chunk of that work on that. And Megan mentioned it in her presentation. We've recommended that there should be, for large transactions, there should be a public interest test, and that before you sell your 25,000 acre estate to Joe Bloggs in Moscow, you're subject to an assessment as to whether this is in the public interest, or whether in fact it might be better to break it up into 5,000 acre lots, or 1,000 acre lots, or whatever. And the government's made it quite clear there will be a land reform bill, another land reform bill in 2023, and it will address some of this. So that's absolutely watch this space stuff. You made the point about tenants. Actually, tenants, the security of tenure offered to a lot of tenants is relatively good in Scotland. The problem is that for those tenants who are not in secure tenancies, the situation is very different. So limited partnerships is one, and limited duration tenancies is the other main one, where at the end of these situations, they can be asked to leave, and that is correct, as things stand at the moment. And there are arguments both ways. Landowners could reasonably argue that they need to have the option at some point of getting their land back. The counter to that would be that secure tenancies enables families to stay in these places, and so on and so forth. So there are no plans at the moment, I think, to strengthen the legislation around that, but it's certainly an area to watch. The point about licensing for forestry and so on has been made already, so I'm not going to belabor that. But what I would say to you and anyone else on the call, there is already a process of public consultation in relation to new forestry plantations. Please make your voice heard. Absolutely make your voice heard. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily agree with you, but make your voice heard. The last point, and possibly the most important point made by you and Martin, is we're all talking about net zero. What about absolute zero? And I think everyone would acknowledge that is a central issue. But I think I'm a kind of, my cup's usually half full, and it does tend to taste better that way. And there's no doubt in my mind that we've set a target which is about net zero, but that's a lot better than where we are now. So let's do everything we can in Scotland to drive towards net zero, because we've got an awful lot of tools. And I've mentioned several of them earlier, carbon sequestration tools. But let's also recognise that as part of the further drive to absolute zero, we are going to need to stop releasing carbon out of Scotland's land. I was not in Moray, but in another part of Scotland recently, and I was simply appalled to see peatland just being crassly overgrazed and burned and all the rest of it. In fact, I tweeted about it. I was so irritated. And carbon just being willfully released into the atmosphere from these places. So we are going to have to tackle that kind of thing. And I think we can. Megan pushed at it, and I think she was bang on. We've got a land rights and responsibilities statement. You should not be entitled to rights in peatland if you are just going to mismanage it and allow the CO2 to leak all over the place. That's not responsible behaviour, and we need to move in that direction. So a long way to go, but I think now that we've got a land commission and we've got a government willing to listen to a land commission, we've got the tools to deal with this.
Thanks, Andrew. And I'm going to come to James because I think he's going to have the final word on this.
Thanks, Sally. It'll just be a brief couple of words. I think one of the things that's really interesting from our perspective is in terms of the public interest test that Andrew mentioned. We first proposed that in 2019 and then refreshed our proposal early last year before a lot of the net zero carbon capture, the big corporate purchases of land that we've seen happened. And I think what this shows is that there's a fundamental issue with our system. And actually our proposals are fairly moderate. I mean, if we look at other sectors of the economy, when we first made our proposals about a public interest test, there was a lot in the news about a merger between Asda and Sainsbury's. And there's obviously not a good thing if there's two massive entities get together to make one even bigger entity. It limits choice, it forces out competition. It's the same in a local area with large land ownership. And we saw that through evidence, and our proposals are very much based on mechanisms that already exist within the wider economy and indeed are perfectly normal in other parts of Europe as well. Secondly, I think one of the other areas that we perhaps miss, and although we've kind of touched on forestry planning, is a more holistic approach to land use planning more generally. And we made recommendations on land use partnerships a couple of years ago. There are pilot projects up and running around Scotland, unfortunately not in Moray, but on either side in Aberdeenshire and Highland, there are partnerships up and running. And the idea behind those is to bring together landowners, communities, locals, with the public sector, so local authorities, SEPA, Scottish Water, others, so that they can all sit down, have that conversation and come up with a holistic framework for land use across a regional landscape. And hopefully that becomes a better forum for making decisions around where the trees are going to be, what types of trees, and getting people involved with it. Because I think Marion made the point that actually she doesn't object to trees, and that's what we find all over the place. It's people don't object to trees and forestry per se. It's the way it's done. It's the way it's managed. And it feels like it's often done to communities and done to local business instead of with them. And I think that's where that joined up integrated land use planning that we're missing at the moment could make a huge difference in the way that both that we reach net zero regionally, locally and nationally, and overcome some of those issues of perhaps being felt that these sorts of things are being done to communities rather than with them.
Thanks, James. And I think that's a really kind of nice way to end this, just this topic, and let us move on to something else, or we'll end up at 8:25 still on this topic. And I understand why we would, because it's probably what we get asked about most everywhere. So if we want to come back to it, if we naturally come back to it towards the end, that's fine. So we've had a really interesting question in the chat from Claire. Thanks for your question about land-based low impact lifestyles. And this is really close to my heart, because I'm a crofter from the Western Isles. So I live a very land-based, not as low impact as I should be, but a fairly low impact lifestyle. My food miles on my mutton and lamb that I eat couldn't be any smaller than it is. But crofting is the reason that I am interested in land reform, and crofting is the reason that I ended up involved in it. And crofting is a really interesting form of tenure that we have in Scotland. It's not perfect. I would never suggest that, but it does open up to communities. It's kept the lights on in many parts of Scotland, which perhaps otherwise the lights wouldn't be on. It forms communities, and it allows people to work cooperatively together on small pieces of land. And I think you've put a couple of really good examples in there, but I think for me that's an example obviously that's really close to my heart. And that's one way of diversifying tenure and sharing land out amongst people and allowing them their piece of land. And as time goes on, it's becoming, as we think of food security, it's becoming more and more important to people. So I'd like to give each members of the panel just an opportunity to talk about this, and just to talk about the kind of implications and the potential for this as we think about diversification of ownership, but also diversification of tenure. So not necessarily, there's so many good examples. I've just given one. It doesn't necessarily need to be about agriculture. I know Andrew's got kind of things close to his heart as well, which are a slightly different take on it. So I'll pass to Andrew first on this, and then we'll go around the panel.
Thanks, Ali. Well, probably briefly, but I want to pick up on crofting first, because in a way, Scotland invented this idea of the importance of small pieces of land, of rooting communities, rooting people into places. Well over 100 years ago, with the Napier Commission, and Sally wouldn't be living where she lives if it weren't for crofting tenure. I suspect that most of those places would be pretty desolate by now. And you can go all around the crofting counties, as they're called, and you find where is designated crofting, there's a lot of people living there, and where it's not designated as crofting land, there's not. And sadly, Moray just missed out on being a crofting county for slightly bizarre historical reasons. It's rumoured that Napier couldn't get his boat in, and that's why Moray didn't make it. But whatever the reason, that's where we are. We've got legislation. So just before I close on crofting, the 2010, I think it was, Act, which I was again involved in, created the opportunity to create new crofts, first of all, which hadn't been there before. So that's there. So a landowner in the crofting counties, and it could be a community landowner, can go to the crofting commission and say, right, we'd like to create some new crofts here. So that's there, that can happen, and it is happening. And actually Nature Scott, a public body, has created new crofts. I think the National Trust has too. So there are examples. But it also, interestingly, created the opportunity for ministers to actually extend the crofting counties out. And I think that's a really interesting one for the future, because if we see crofting, and as Sally said, the diversification of tenure rather than just the diversification of ownership as one of the tools we can use here, then actually there's no reason to restrict crofting to crofting counties. It might as well be the whole of Scotland. And that would be a game changer in many ways. Beyond that, I think the public interest test, depending on how it's brought in, has a serious potential here, because it seems to me that what's likely to happen is when you say you want to sell your 25,000 acre estate, it's quite likely that what will come back will be, well, you can sell 20,000 acres of it because there's coherence in there, there's a business argument for it, but the rest of it you need to sell off in wee bits. So I think there's a tool, potentially a tool in there. But in the meantime, I hope that increasingly the concept of what is responsible land ownership will include a willingness to sell small bits of land to people doing things. And I agree. I've visited places in England where it's happened. I have to be fair, visited places in Scotland where it's happened as well. And although I haven't visited them, I'm where it's happening in Wales, so it is happening. And what I hope is that while statutory tools certainly could be helpful, what I really hope is that increasingly it will simply become the norm, that owners of land will see that as part of the normal business, that they every so often they review their business and they say, okay, we really don't need that with that bit of land and that bit of land, so we'll sell it.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm going to come to Megan now, and Megan also lives in the Crofting County, so.
Yes, I'll try, and despite being part of a crofting family, I'm going to not talk about crofting. I mean, I think Claire is quite right. We really have to think about land ownership and land reform models, which will help us, you know, as a counterbalance to this kind of big push for natural capital that we've just been discussing. We also need to think about smallholder models and small scale use and ownership and management of land as a means for people at a household level to become to help us move to the net zero objectives and this within this transition as well. Couple of things I wanted to say in response to this question. First is that we need to remember this isn't just about rural areas or the crofting counties. There are so many examples of communities taking control of vacant and derelict sites in urban and peri-urban areas in order to produce community gardens, community allotments, green space, things which are helping them in their area reduce their food miles, increase their own food, increase their ability to grow food, to grow fruit, to have all the mental health and the well-being benefits from being able to be in and around and active in green space and in soil and gardening. So there's lots of things happening there as well, which aren't necessarily kind of classically what you would think of when you talk about smallholder food production, but are really, really relevant. And land reform and all the work that the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force and everything been doing there is really helping that to happen. There's a lot of examples on the MyLand webpage I mentioned of different communities across different urban parts of Scotland who are having really amazing community growing projects there. So I think that's one thing to remember, that this is something that can be done across Scotland and is happening across Scotland. The other thing, I'm really glad you mentioned that the One Planet development scheme and the Welsh experience here. There's a lot of interest within the Scottish Government about what's happening in Wales. There's a lot of interest within the Welsh Government about what's happening in Scotland around the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. And I know that, that conversations have been happening. So I think we should watch this space because I think that there's a lot of commonalities there, and there's things that are being learned and explored and thought about. So that's really interesting. And maybe I should hand over to James, Sally, to talk about the role of diversification of land ownership and kind of innovative governance models, because that's the other angle I think is relevant here, if you don't mind, James.
Thanks very much, Megan. And James, if you could also answer the question while you're about it, why is not the whole of Scotland a crofting county? Just throw that in there. I think that's a great idea.
Thanks, Sally. So the answer to that one is quite simple, that after the Crofting Acts were introduced, there was a complaint that there wasn't a similar system in the rest of Scotland. So government introduced the Small Landholders Acts, which are also still in force to this day, which provide very similar tenure options to crofting, albeit I think without the Grazings and Grazings Commission function at all. So there is a piece of legislation there if people want to dig it out and have a look.
Thank you, James. I knew you would have the spot on technical answer for me.
That's and also just as by the by, they're allowed in. You can have smallholding tenure within the crofting counties, but obviously not vice versa. So maybe it's better legislation overall. Who knows? In terms of the diversification, I think one of the things that struck me coming out of our research into concentrated land ownership is that one of the biggest asks we had from people responding to that, generally members of the public, was a request for the ability to be able to find that small plot of land on which to build a house and maybe have a couple of acres to grow food for the family. Nothing massive, nothing kind of huge, not a kind of global, kind of empire in the making. It's just that kind of small ambition for which there really isn't a huge amount of space in Scotland. And I think, as Andrew touched on, it partly becomes down to, because we have this pattern of large estates, they tend to get sold as large estates, and there's very little option for ordinary people to be able to get a slice of that. And one of the ways out with the kind of the legislative options and perhaps some of the remedies that come with lotting or partitioning is to change the way that the governance models work. So many large landholdings are things like limited companies that may have one or two directors who happen to be the family members of the same family that's owned that estate for a long time. But there's no reason that has to be the case. Having a broader range of directors on a board, and many of the landowners do, brings different experiences, different abilities, different points of view that then changes the way that landholding is managed. And that's a very simple way to view things that could be done within our current system. If we look further abroad, or even to the likes of the corporate sector, there are much greater options available. So one of the things that's quite common in forestry ownership in the likes of Finland is cooperatives. So you have a lot of small forestry owners who by themselves would never be able to manage the forestry, to get all the heavy machinery, to do the work of thinning and harvesting and planting and everything by themselves. But by working together, they build that economy of scale and essentially are joint estate managers. So there's all these different types of models that are out there, and the work that we'll be publishing in May draws on some of these options, so cooperatives in particular, because they're incredibly common, particularly in a European context, but also looking to the corporate world in terms of board governance, corporate structures, how you include different voices and perspectives as part of the management and decision-making process. And German corporate sector, all the large companies there have a system of co-determination where their boards include, by statute, by law, a proportion of workers or employees. So there's no reason, again, why that sort of system perhaps doesn't have a relevance to large land ownerships, where if there's a governing board, yes, you have the landowners and their advisors, but if there's a part of the community also on that within the decision making, getting sight of the financials so that everyone's on the same page and really sees the issues on the ground, then perhaps that opens up other opportunities, it opens new opportunities. It also helps explain the decision making and really root the community within that land holding, and that builds a stronger relationship overall. So there's a whole range of different options and different learning that can be taken both from what we have already, but also particularly from the international context. And that's what the paper that we're publishing, hopefully in mid-May, will be saying.
Thanks very much, James. That's really interesting. And I think that Martin's put a really interesting comment in the chat. And I think that kind of summarizes it and brings it all together really nicely, which is great. I want to move on to another topic now, and I'm hoping it'll generate a few questions in the chat. And that is, we've just had a really interesting question on vacant and derelict, so I'll pop over to that, as I was planning on coming to vacant and derelict next. So that's perfect timing for a question. So the two topics I would like us to try and cover in the next 20 minutes before we wrap up would be vacant and derelict land and housing. And obviously those two topics are, as always with land reform, quite connected. So on a very small scale, does the footprint of a derelict building come under the heading of derelict land? So I think this is a question to sort of talk about the technicalities of derelict land. And this is something I'm actually asked about a lot. So sometimes people can not quite understand the kind of technicalities behind it, what's actually classified, what isn't, but does it necessarily change the next steps or not? So I'm going to come to James first for a kind of technical answer on this, if possible. James, if that's okay.
Yeah, I will try and remember. So certainly the footprint of the site is what's measured. I think off the top of my head, though, the threshold is 0.1 hectares, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually in an urban context, if you've got derelict buildings, they can easily be under that. So I think that's where we are. Yeah, with that. I can double check, but I see nodding from Sally, so I'm assuming that's the right figure.
I'm trusting you, but yeah, no, I think you are right with that, and it is something I've been asked about before, because as you say, in an urban context, there could be a derelict building that's having a really big influence on the community, but it's not necessarily classified in that. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about the Vacant and Derelict Task Force, and maybe a little bit about the new community route map that's just been launched, just gone live? If you'd be happy to, James.
It's not my area of expertise, but I will do what I can.
Sorry,
So,
I'm putting you on the spot tonight.
That's fine.
Apologies to James.
So I was involved with the task force, but not so much afterwards. So certainly the work of the task force was kind of the first big piece of work I think that the Commission took on in the urban realm. And essentially what we discovered through that work is that there are a number of sites, and they got the acronym DUSTIES, which is disused something, whatever. But they're sites that essentially had been vacant and derelict for more than 20 years. And these are the particularly troublesome sites, often post-industrial, so there's issues with contamination. Often the areas that they're in have kind of suffered the worst of economic depression over the intervening time, and there hasn't been the interest to redevelop them or to bring new opportunities for communities. So the task force made a kind of a really deep look at these structural issues, and the recommendations that it came out with are quite broad, right across government, private sector, in terms of how some of these sites can be shifted and how we can ensure that there isn't a future legacy arising from perhaps the next wave of deindustrialization or change in the way the society works, as has happened previously. So some of the areas that I particularly worked around was on the public sector recommendations, and very much around being a bit more proactive on behalf of government and then local authorities, joining up different data sources so that things like the ownership of complex sites is often split between different numbers of companies, and some of them may be defunct and have been struck off the register years previously. So there's all those issues, bringing them together and actually making sure that all the public sector is joined up on kind of bringing these sites, assembling the land into a cohesive package that then actually becomes a viable opportunity for a developer, whether that's a private developer or the community or indeed the public sector itself, to move that site on to do something productive with. And in the community vein, there's obviously more support required because it's a new area and it can be incredibly technically complex. So my colleagues have been working on a route map and have been developing, and in that partnership with DTAS, the Development Trust Association of Scotland, to try and pilot some projects as well to get these small sites, particularly the smaller kind of 0.1 hectare size or under, that really only have a potential community reuse, because many of the larger sites could be changed to the next wave of development or office space. A lot of the smaller sites are often also the ones that attract the most attention, because it is that scrubby piece of ground that's beside people's houses. It is perhaps the play area from a housing development that actually no one knows who owns it, and it would be nice to have a play area for the kids instead of an overgrown site that attracts antisocial behavior. So trying to bring those sites back into community use is challenging, but it's something that we recognize needs to be done, because fundamentally the private sector doesn't have an interest in developing the next business there. So I think that's a really kind of positive thing to have done, and what it allows us to do is then set out that route map of working on the ground with communities, addressing the problems, finding out what the problems are, trying to feed in the aspirations that communities have, and then share that learning through DTAS in particular, but also through the work that we and my colleagues do in helping communities take ownership of those sites, both literally take ownership, but also in terms of management and putting their own stamp on it and essentially meeting their own needs and aspirations.
Thanks very much, James. That was great. And you always know that you've come up with a great kind of shortened version of a name when none of us remember what it means, but it's just become the Dusty Sites, and that's it, which is fantastic. And feeling a little bit guilty for putting James on the spot there for something that isn't his area of expertise, is I double checked the task force recommendation as he was beginning to speak, and it is 0.1, but one of the recommendations did include the recommendation that it was extended to include them. So that was recognised as an issue during the task force research and work, which is great. And I would recommend having a look on myland.scot for some case studies and examples. There's quite a lot of work on this, and there's a fantastic podcast about meanwhile use, which is about making other uses You know, if you've got a site that is currently vacant or derelict, there is actually plans for it, but in the interim, it's a bit of a blight. There's a really, really interesting podcast about the communities getting to use it in the interim. And it's one of those podcasts where I put on, Andrew's heard this before, I put it on when I was cooking, and you put it on and you think, this is great, I'll just listen to this while I'm cooking, and then all of a sudden you realise the onions are burning and you've forgot to chop things up. You're no longer following the recipe because you're so engrossed in a podcast. So it's really worthwhile listening to, and then you end up pausing and going back because you've turned around to stir something and you've missed a bit. So definitely worthwhile and nice listen to that. And it was an urban example during the COP26 conference, and it was really fascinating, and I really enjoyed listening to it. Would Megan or Andrew like to talk about vacant and derelict, or move us on to housing? Andrew?
There's a couple of things I think very just quick things that we're saying. The first is the community right to buy for sustainable development. So there is a statutory tool there. It's still early days, but you know, if there are vacant and derelict sites, and I suppose one should also say there's a register of vacant and derelict sites, and then there's other sites that people think are vacant and derelict. So let's be clear about that. But either of those, if a community decides that it really wants to take this over and do something, there is a right to buy for sustainable development. You can force the issue if you have to, and it's worth looking into. I'm not going to go into detail of that, but it's worth looking at. The other thing I want to mention is we gave a very specific piece of advice to government early on, suggesting that there's something called a compulsory sales order should be created. And the bones of the advice was that a local authority should be able to say, look, that piece of land, you know, like that big piece in Forest, for example, that piece of land is a blight on our community, a blight on our voters. And if the owner of that piece of land is not going to do something productive with it, we should have the right to force it to be sold at auction to someone who will. And we set that out in detail. My understanding is that government probably will legislate to do that, so that probably will come. It may be part of the forthcoming community empowerment bill. Not certain yet, but you know, although local authorities have a compulsory purchase order right already, they need to find the money if they're going to do that, and then they need to do something themselves. The joy of a compulsory sale order is simply that if you own a piece of land and you don't do something productive with it, you will have to sell it at auction to someone else who will. I think it was a good recommendation, and I think we still stand by it. I think that's probably all I want to say, Sally, on that issue.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. I'm going to pass to Megan now. You're very, if you'd like to talk about that at all, Megan, I'd be really interested to hear from you. And then moving on to housing, and housing is something that affects everyone right across Scotland, and it's something we hear about a lot. So I just wondered if you just wanted to open up the topic a little bit and just talk a little bit about the work we've done, and kind of the urban and rural context of it.
Great, thank you. I mean, I suppose on that question about the vacant and derelict building, I suppose the question really is, what would you want? How would you like that building to be developed? Because as Andrew said, there are various different routes. If the building is owned by a local authority, there's the community asset transfer route, where you can start using that route as a means to negotiate about how the community can acquire it from a local authority or a public body. If it's privately owned, there's the various different routes to buy. Our recommendation always is that you try and engage the private landowner around a negotiated transfer first, is a more straightforward route rather than going through the rights to buy. But there are various different community rights to buy now, and there's lots of route maps available on our website, and other organisations like the Scottish Government Community Land Team and the Development Trust Association Scotland and Community Land Scotland and HIE and HIE's area have lots of information available about the ways in which communities can start to think about acquiring assets which are currently vacant and derelict or not being used at the moment. Yes, housing. We get a lot of questions about housing, and I always try and start to caveat that the answer or any discussion about housing by saying we are not the Housing Commission, we are the Land Commission. So whilst we are aware that there are significant problems and challenges facing access to affordable housing and the ability of people to find good quality and affordable homes in the places they want to live across different parts of Scotland. Our entry point to the sort of range of solutions to this has always been the focus on the availability of land for housing, rather than the development of the housing and the sort of the housing sector, which there are other parts of government and other bodies which are responsible and working on that. So we, as I mentioned in the presentation, we and I can't quite remember when the research was published, but within the last 6 months, we published this body of work that looked at how the challenges around the availability of land for housing, and that covers both urban areas and also remote rural areas. And there are significant challenges in both areas, and the challenges are different because the way in which land is acquired to develop housing and the way in which those houses are being developed is very different depending on the types of infrastructure and economies of scale that you're operating on, in comparison to large scale housing development in urban areas, in comparison to the role that Communities Housing Trust and local community-based organisations in remote rural areas provide housing on maybe less 5 or 10 plots. So we've focused a lot on the role that land can play there, and what can be done to help support the availability of land for housing, and what can help support the communities who are trying to deliver housing, and what kind of support can be given to in terms of changes to the planning system or changes to the role that groups like Communities Housing Trust, who help work with local communities in remote and rural areas in the provision of housing, can play. But we've also looked at, as I said, the more market-led development, large-scale housing developments in urban areas, and how that can be reformed in order to make sure that there is a better delivery of affordable housing within those developments. There's some really interesting examples of how this is being done very well. There's an example outside Edinburgh called the Winchborough development, where the developer is developing housing at scale, but is doing that in conjunction and in collaboration with the local community, and it's very much community-led effort. So there's a case study of that on the Myland Scott website, so have a look at that. It's got some really interesting lessons to learn. But also, as I said at the beginning, we've been doing a lot of work working with local authorities and public bodies in the kind of leadership role that they need to play in, and how that can be resourced and how they can have the time and confidence to do that in order to step that delivery of housing at scale away from being entirely market-led and more place-based focused. And again, actually looking at what's done in some other European countries and how we can be following those models here in Scotland. I think that's probably enough for me. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Megan, and thank you, Martin, for your comments in the chat. I think they very much pick up the themes we're talking about here. I'm going to pass to Andrew on this now, just to give you a brief opportunity to talk about it.
Just a brief overview, quite Sally, really, from the recommendations we've made on this. The guts of it is, I think, that we've said, look, in Scotland, we allow a relatively small number of large house building companies to pretty much control the market for housing land. And so government in whatever form, local government, national government, local community, is left in a sense responding to planning applications from the people who control land. So in a sense, society is not in control of what land is used for housing. Society can only respond by saying yes or no to planning consent to proposals that come in from people who control land. Now that is quite different in many other parts of Europe, and I think it's worth drawing that distinction. In many other parts of Europe, government is much more in control. Government says, right, we've decided that that area of land or that piece of land is going to be developed for housing, and there's no they have the powers. It's not a matter of, please, Mr. Landowner, would you mind? It is, we've decided. So what we've recommended is that, and I'm not going to go into detail, but you can read there. But essentially what we've recommended is that Scotland would be better off if government was more assertive about where houses go and what land is developed for housing. And we've recommended mechanisms whereby that might be done. But the guts of it is, let's learn. There's no point in reinventing wheels here. Other parts of Europe appear to do this much better. Let's learn from that, and let's not copy, but let's model ourselves on that much more assertive approach that you'll see taken in Germany or Denmark or Netherlands or these places. And that feels sensible to me.
Thanks, Andrew. James, would you like to add anything on this topic?
Yeah, just briefly, I think one of the other areas that we did look at specifically was rural housing. And although it's quite a different setup, some of the issues are very much the same. So again, around the access to land and control over land. And I think one of the interesting things that that piece of work picked out is that where in perhaps more urban Scotland, you have this one large house building entity that does everything from acquisition through the planning through to the building itself. In rural Scotland, there tends to be a much broader mix of players. So there will be separate landowners or people seeking for self-build plots. There will be kind of small companies, medium-sized house builders who will actually do the building. And it's getting a balance between finding opportunities for those types of smaller businesses to thrive as well. And one of the other things that I think is quite interesting, that comes back to the point around local authorities and government being more assertive. Perhaps I'm not aware of a case within Moray Council, but certainly within other councils in Scotland, the housing needs and assessment demand, where the council assesses where new houses should be built. In some of remote and rural areas where the young people have left, the assessment is made that, well, the young people have left, so therefore we don't need to provide housing. And therefore the next generation of young people also leave. So the next round of assessment is, well, the young people have left again, so we still don't need to provide any more housing. And it's that kind of vicious circle that exists in areas of policy that probably needs to be joined up, because at the same time as that's happening in rural areas, you have urban areas, whether it's around Forest or Elgin or Inverness, that are growing massively. They've expanded massively over the years and continue to grow. Whereas there are other areas in the rural hinterland, there are villages that are perhaps struggling, but actually a half a dozen, maybe up to 20 houses would breathe new life into that settlement, put more kids in the school, keep that open, provide people to use the local shop and the facilities. So it's not just about housing per se, it's about the knock-on effects that the system that we have at the moment has in terms of expanding urban sprawl and depopulating rural areas. So I think with the rural housing work, there's a different focus in it and a different vein of work, but fundamentally it comes back to local authorities and government being more assertive, setting out where the housing needs to be built, and actually helping those other businesses like house builders, small family companies who are house builders, giving them the opportunity to build a thriving business, and perhaps taking some of that control away from the large volume builders that do everything and perhaps monopolize the market.
Thanks very much, James. And that was a really lovely way to end it. And it's always so interesting to me with housing that you have small scale and large scale, but you can see the same problems on almost every part of Scotland. And I find that really fascinating. We're drawing to a close now. We've just got a few minutes left. I'm going to just wrap up now. I'm going to wrap up by starting with an apology to Bruce that we didn't pick up your question on Muirburn. The Land Commission is a small organisation. We have a small number of employees. I think we punch above our weight with the work we produce and the scope we do, but that's out with our remit and within someone else's remit. So we don't like to tread on too many toes too much of the time. So apologies we didn't come to that one. I'll start with some thank yous now. So thank you very much to Jess behind the scenes. As you can see, she has kept us going with lots of links, loads of information. She's kept us right. She hasn't had to give too much of a reminder to me to keep on time, which is great. She will be popping a survey up. Please do give us your feedback. We'd love to know how we can change this to make it better for you. Thank you so much to my panel members, especially to James. It's always great to have you on the panel because you have such a wide breadth of knowledge, and you kind of explain everything so clearly, and you've got that technical background that we really, really appreciate. And I do appreciate that we always push you. We always push you. So that's great. And thanks to Andrew and Megan for joining us tonight and being on the panel. They did the hard work, not me. They answered the tough questions. It's much easier sitting in this seat and forcing everyone else to answer the tough questions. But most importantly, thank you to all of you for giving us your evening, giving us your time, letting us know your thoughts and your questions. It's been brilliant. This helps us know what's important to people, and it helps us reassure ourselves that the time and energy we're putting into things like natural capital is the right topic, because it's top of your priority list just now. So that's really great. So thank you so much. I don't have anything left to say apart from please fill in the survey. We're always available. Drop us an email. You can always get in touch with the Commission and say, I've got a particular question for James, or a particular question for Andrew or Megan or Sally or one of the other commissioners, or just a general question, and we'll direct it to the right person. Please do keep in touch. We have all the usual social media channels, website. myland.scot is a great resource. So yeah, we've got a newsletter as well that you can sign up to receive, which is, it doesn't come too often, so it's not too much for your inbox, but it's always really interesting and it has some useful links. We have a good practice team. I know from some of the questions tonight and some of the comments, and I know from some of the really, really interesting community projects in your area that there might be some of you that would like to get in touch. Maybe we'll be able to help you, maybe we'll be able to signpost you, but do get in touch with the good practice team if you've ever got questions about things, or you're wondering about something like the legislation Andrew referred to and you'd like more information. So yeah, so thank you very much from us, and it's been great, and maybe we'll meet you in the flesh, or maybe we'll be back virtually to see you all soon. Thank you.